Transylvanian Sunrise. By Radu Sinamar with Peter Moon. Apparently, your logic is healthy. What you don't probably know yet is that time in itself is an illusory notion. Of course, time has a subtle energy, but this is modulated by the specificity of our consciousness or perception. For instance, the same time interval, say 1 hour, is perceived subjectively by different people because, to some, time passes slowly, while to others, time passes quickly. Others may even say that, time passed in the blink of an eye. Perceptions are different although the time interval is the same. Man's consciousness gets only the illusion of the past or the future because, in their turn, these notions derive from the fragmented perception ordinary human beings have of time. Now, imagine that this extremely subtle form of energy we call time looks, metaphorically speaking, like a continuous strip or an unrolled photo film. Cesar then made a simple sketch on a piece of paper so that the explanations he was giving could be as clear as possible. I was eager to learn from him new secrets about realities that, until then, were inaccessible to my knowledge. Noting my attitude of sincerity on repeated occasions, Cesar tacitly accepted to guide me, like a true master, through the deceitful shadows beyond which lies true initiating knowledge. The time axis is continuous, but people have a split perception of it, quantified into a past and a future. In common terms, the present is relative because the present moment becomes the past in the next moment. In its turn, the next moment becomes the new present, although one moment before it was the future. Being continuous, time is like an unfolding strip. People live in this very time strip and identify themselves with its partial aspects. They no longer perceive the whole of the time strip which is continuous but fragments of it, a past and a future, as their consciousness itself is limited only to a fragment of knowledge. Now, let's assume this consciousness expands and grows like a huge sphere engulfing almost the entire universe in its field of perception and knowledge. This expansion is enough to go beyond the time barrier which one then perceives as a unitary whole that is forever present. Past and future lose their relative sense. Then, he who experiences this level of consciousness becomes a sort of detached observer with a very large field of vision at his disposal. By way of analogy, one is like a tourist in a town full of traditions. At the beginning of the journey, one walks the streets and visits all the interesting places, one by one, because one doesn't have the possibility of seeing everything at a time. Buildings, people, cars and trees, they all stand in the way. But as soon as one gets up high into the air, as if in a balloon, one can see the entire town at a single glance. Any area or building one may be looking for can be instantly spotted because the whole hustle and bustle of the town, though fragmented to the different inhabitants in its different areas, can be viewed simultaneously and in all its details as a whole. I hope this analogy is descriptive enough for you to understand this time problem as well as possible. Traveling in time is nothing else than the expansion of consciousness which then has access to the reality of the energy of time. This is difficult to achieve and few people get to master and control it to perfection. But there are intermediary stages as well. Octavian was in one of those stages. Unfortunately, in 1984, he was relocated and I have never seen him since. Although I had grasped the gist of the explanations, I still had a few queries. For instance, it was not clear how consciousness could expand or how by an act of will one could perceive a certain fragment of time. No sooner had those problems sprung to mind than Cesar replied instantly before I had the time to ask the question. In order to be able to really travel in time at a conscious level, one needs a particularly refined perception and level of knowledge. Once the temporal target is established at mental level, focusing one's mental energy on that area will trigger a resonance process whereby one gets to actually live in the respective time interval and perfectly identify oneself with the frames of mind, emotions and features of those times, much like a spectator at a film who somehow becomes part of the reality of that film. In other words, one can see, hear, smell, taste and touch exactly as one would normally do in one's own time frame, except that sensations are felt as there and then because they already happened. This in fact gives one the certainty that the experience of time traveling was a true one rather than the illusory product of a rampant imagination. Of course, there is also a possibility for the physical body to travel in time, but the way in which this can be achieved individually requires more complex explanations. Besides, the motivation for such a journey must be very strong and important because, at the time of the journey, there are major interferences. For the moment, I was satisfied with those clarifications and, deep down, I sincerely set myself the goal of getting to experience those fascinating realities myself. During the time he spent at the base in B, Cesar made remarkable progress, developing his perception skills and abilities for subtle action. Some of his extraordinary spiritual experiences were known to the mysterious Dr. Sheehan who, with much competence and care, had shown Cesar the way all that while, and whenever difficulties came up, Dr. Sheehan and his assistant suddenly disappeared shortly after the revolution in 1989, but nobody seemed to know how and why that had happened. The general point of view was that a long contract of collaboration was over. I am sure Cesar knew the truth about it, but for some reason, he did not want to give me more details. The contacts between Cesar and the other occupants of the establishment were very few in number and only circumstantial, the rules in this respect being very hard and fast. In fact, until the beginning of 1986, he was the only one to be kept at that location without being transferred. None of those whom he found there in 1980 stayed there until his departure. As time passed, his mates were sent to other locations, but the reasons for those transfers remained unknown. Other people would be brought in, but Cesar could not find out much about them because they were transferred quite quickly. 1986 was a turning point in Cesar's life and reached a climax with an extraordinary spiritual experience. The events of those times were nevertheless closely linked to the presence and actions of the head of Department 0, Colonel Obadiah. He greatly appreciated Cesar and the two of them often discussed various issues relating to the activity of the department. Though a teenager, Cesar's personality was nowhere near the normality associated with that age. The life and experience at the base in B unfolded to other standards, a lot higher than those of the outside world. The place appeared to belong eerily to a parallel world where the laws of physics and the concepts and ideas of its inhabitants no longer obeyed unanimously accepted norms. It is true that, as the head of Department 0, Colonel Obadiah saw mostly to military, security, administrative and even political issues, but he was also fully aware of the content of each subject's secret file, following the activity and achievements of everybody who was brought there with much interest. At that time, Obadiah was one of the few Securitate people of impeccable moral conduct and kept an open mind. At the same time, he was also politically canny against the various forces and interests at play. Subsequent events were to prove that the colonel's plans and ideas had already been put into practice in that period, but let us not anticipate. In 1986, a clash of interests was smoldering between Obadiah and the head of the Securitate who was not much in favor of the independence of the department. The latter had already run several checks at Department 0 bases. There was no justification to prompt those checks, but that was a way of gradually undermining Obadiah's position in front of Ceausescu, with reports ending on an unfavorable note being submitted to the dictator. The idea was to depose Obadiah and absorb Department 0 into the general structure of the Securitate, which would have enabled decision-making powers over the department. The scheme, however, was only half-baked and short of finesse. Ceausescu himself, who was known for his suspicious mind, did not pay the head of the Securitate much attention, but tension was there. That was why Obadiah had to act carefully and take a winding course to bypass the vigilance of his superior, the head of the Securitate. That year, the colonel made the surprising decision that Cesar should visit his family, which he justified by a so-called shaky, emotional balance of the subject that had to be restored. In reality, Cesar said with a slight smile, Obadiah's intention was entirely different. The visit was only a smoke-screen, a red herring for a much more important action. As far as I was concerned, I was fully aware of my family's situation even if I was physically apparently isolated from my parents. For instance, I knew that my father had died 2 years before in a stupid accident, and with much difficulty, my mother had recovered after the loss. You must be wondering how I got to know that without leaving the base and without anybody informing me about what had happened. I can tell you it was only my physical body that was restricted in its movement, but I had very great freedom of thought and action in other subtle bodies. In response to the bewilderment and distrust that could be read on my face, Cesar continued to explain with goodwill and patience. Your doubt stems from a lack of knowledge about essential realities. It's as if you wore a coat padded out with money about which you know absolutely nothing. You continue to wear it, but you go begging every day to support yourself. I think you have already understood we are far more than a physical body with a weight attached. Practical experience will prove this to you without a trace of doubt. You will then discover that a different body, a lot more flexible and light, if I can say so, is at your disposal to make known to you many other secrets and mysteries. Of course, this body that is more subtle in nature than the physical body is itself governed by certain laws and restrictions because there are structures in us that are yet a lot more refined and subtle than this other body, but by comparison to the physical body, this one is located in a higher dimension which the occult and the initiated call the astral dimension. Acquiring the ability of being conscious about your own astral body as one is about the physical body is a relatively easy process to some people. It involves a certain degree of purification and elevation of consciousness at that level. There are very many human beings who have lived at least one such experience which papers in the field call conscious astral division or extrasensory experience. Such an experience can happen accidentally, for instance, such as after a strong emotion or during REM sleep when, for shorter or longer periods, one is aware one is dreaming. Or, they can happen by an act of will, whenever one pleases, but that is more difficult to achieve. Some people who have already attained a high degree of development of their psychic and spiritual abilities are perfectly aware of their astral body, even when they live and act normally in their physical body. But this involves a highly elevated level of individual consciousness development about which we shall not be talking now. Generally, those who live the experience of conscious astral division want to get information about or access to special places or circumstances due to some mean or selfish interests they are pursuing. The method is and was used with a certain margin of error in military, economic or even political espionage by the great powers of the world. Yet, those who make use of this psychic power in a selfish manner are confronted with repeated failure, disillusion and stagnation at inferior levels of thought and behavior because they don't know or simply ignore certain essential laws that describe the harmony and relation between the act and its result. By way of analogy, it's the same as when a pipe through which water runs freely gets gradually stuck on accumulating dirt to the point of blockage. That is why many of those who, at the beginning stages, enjoyed the various psychic powers they had acquired or had already had could in time note a gradual diminution of those powers and to the point of total loss in some cases. This must make you understand the particular importance of responsibility for an action in such cases. You should know that in their great majority, and particularly for reasons of ignorance or lethargy, people prefer to deny the things or facts to which they don't have direct access through their senses or direct experience. But only a few due to a certain degree of elevation they have attained actually realize that the freedom of action they enjoy in conscious astral division experiences is a reality they must use in a constructive rather than selfish manner. One can then notice and know aspects of daily life that are relatively ordinary, but it is also possible to learn secrets that some people would want to know but cannot know. Just as there are barriers at the physical level, there are also certain barriers at the astral level blocking access to information about certain secret places or aspects. Still, the freedom for action and movement is way beyond the possibilities at the physical level. Obstacles and barriers at the astral level are meant to serve as a selection process for those who want to learn certain secrets and mysteries. This is done by taking into account both their specific vibrational frequency and the reason behind the act. At the astral level, movement obeys principles that are entirely different from those in the physical world, being triggered by an act of will and happening either at a certain speed, usually very high or almost instantly to any spot on this planet, whether underwater, underground, above ground or in the air. More special in nature are travels in cosmic space to other planets or celestial bodies when, at the first stage, experiences should be limited to our solar system. At a later stage, however, as some aspects and secret laws of the universe are gradually understood correctly, travels can extend to galactic level, allowing for the exploration of various areas in our galaxy. As far as the projections of our individual consciousness at an intergalactic level are concerned, these are possible by means of other bodies a lot more subtle than the astral one, but we shall not be talking about this here and now. What I mostly wanted to make you understand is that physical matter has no influence whatsoever on the movement of the astral body. Instead, this movement is obstructed by certain subtle forces and entities acting at certain points or in certain key areas at both astral and physical levels where access to information is restricted. For instance, this sort of restriction can be met where protection must be secured, as in the case with treasures or special and secret storehouses, certain gates, galleries or quick access pathways to other spots on the planet or even other worlds. At other times, astral obstacles restrict access to certain occult initiations or mysteries that are protected by specially summoned guardian entities. These should not be construed as immutable restrictions, but they concern mostly those who are not sufficiently evolved and therefore are not yet ready to confront certain mysteries without being intent on using them for personal and selfish purposes. There is a lot more to be said about the practical ways of acquiring conscious astral division powers as well as about other details concerning the very experience of astral division, but the time will come when we can talk about all this in detail. For now, suffice it to say that Colonel Obadiah's real intention was not to send me to the town of F, to visit my mother, obviously under special security measures, but to take me on a very secret journey to the monastery of Cernica near Bucharest. You do understand that in those times it was highly dangerous for top political or military officials to visit religious establishments. The communist regime, atheistic through its very doctrine, would condemn any such approach from the very beginning under the threat of commensurate punishment. I knew nothing about the destination of our journey until we got to the gate of the monastery. I was accompanied by Colonel Obadiah, and we traveled at night by helicopter from the base to Bucharest and in an off-road vehicle from Bucharest to Cernica. On the way, the colonel told me he wanted me to meet and talk with a clergyman, a very special priest who, he said, was a real saint endowed with great powers and divine grace. Once at the gate of the monastery, I saw many cars full of people who had come from all over the country to visit the monastery or pray in all their faith. In fact, Obadiah told me that almost everybody waiting on the highway had come there to talk with that hermit called Arseny Boca. The colonel had already planned the meeting several days in advance. While we were walking through the courtyard heading for the hermit's cell, I could note the presence of 2 guards in mufti who had taken position on both sides of the cell's door. The 2 men were there for security reasons so that we would not be disturbed throughout the discussion. Although it was not yet dawn and the weather outside was pretty cold, several monks were moving hurriedly through the courtyard without making any noise, probably heading for their morning prayers.